Did everyone hear that? Was it just... Didn't know it did that. I was just going to say we're going to record the meeting for those who couldn't make it, but that polite American lady just let us know. So yeah, the meeting's being recorded. I hope that's okay with everybody. Today we've got Simon Shreve, who's the service manager from the People from Abroad team, aptly named, does what it says on the tin at Norfolk County Council. And yeah, this is one of our Homes for Cathy webinars that we've been doing over the pandemic. We've gone to digital and it's really worked for us. So we've been doing these online webinars. Just a little introduction from me. I'm Cathy Doherty and I'm local delivery manager here at Broadland, but I'm the lead on homelessness as well, and leading on the Homes for Cathy commitments that Broadland are committed to. Some of the stuff that Broadland have done is that we've got properties in Norwich that we let peppercorn rent for migrant, recourse to public funds, isn't it? Yep. And we're just about to work out some stuff for interpreters who've been in Afghanistan, and now services are withdrawing there. So the Americans and the British are withdrawing from there. They are at risk. So yeah, just Simon's going to do his presentation, and you're going to have questions at the end. Simon, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So if people have got questions, probably best to pop them in the chat, and then Katie, if you can keep an eye on those, and we'll cover them at the end. If that works for everybody.
Okay, thank you. Over to Simon.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to come along and speak this afternoon. My system is telling me I have low network bandwidth, so if I start to break up, can somebody let me know, and then I can repeat if something gets missed. And I'm going to have a go at presenting on Zoom, and I've never done this before because I've always done it on Teams. So hopefully you'll be able to see my screen.
You can, yeah.
Somebody tell me you got that. So I've done a bit of a presentation to take you through what kind of work that the People from Abroad team do within adult social care. So we're part of the mental health division of adult social care at Norfolk County Council. We're a social work team, community-based social work team. We do also have a bit of a remit that covers children in need and their families, and I'll cover that in the presentation so you can see where we pick up some of the cases on behalf of children's services, but we sit structurally within the adult services department. We've been in existence since the autumn of 2016 when we commenced delivery of the Syrian refugee resettlement program, and once the team was set up, we were able to gradually expand to cover other areas of work. I'm a qualified social worker by background. I've been a social worker for 22 years. I'm approved under the Mental Health Act, so I keep that portfolio alive. I'm also a best interest assessor under the Deprivation Liberty Safeguards, which is for people who lack mental capacity. I've worked with migrants, refugees and asylum seekers for the last 22 years. One of the first things I did when I qualified was working with Kosovan migrants, Kosovan asylum seekers, back in the day before asylum support was actually a mechanism and everything fell to the local authority to provide support. Right, let's move on. So I want to talk to you about primarily adults who are migrants, so single adults or couples or family units with no dependent child under 18. I said before that we do have a bit of a remit within children's services to provide support, but primarily my team will work with adults. And that means we will work with those who are nationals of member states of the European Economic Area who don't have settled status under the EU settlement scheme. They may have pre-settled status under the new scheme, but that doesn't always mean that they've got what we would label as recourse to public funds, because there are lots of different complicated rules around benefits and housing. We'll work with people who are recognised refugees in another European member state, work with asylum seekers who've been refused, who've exhausted their appeal rights. We work with people who are visa entrants to the UK who've got a no recourse to public funds endorsement on their visa, which means that they can't claim benefits and housing. people who may be irregularly entrant or present in the UK, including people who've overstayed their visa. We can provide some support, and we will work with asylum seekers who are not receiving support from the Home Office under the asylum support mechanism. One of the other, a couple of the other areas that are quite often overlooked, we will work with non-EU nationals who primary carers are British nationals. They're called Zambrano carers for people who haven't come across them before. And also British nationals who return to the UK after a period of settled residence abroad, and they fail something called the habitual residence test in those circumstances, and may be arriving back in the UK expecting to gain access to benefits and homelessness assistance, and suddenly finding that they're unable to access that initially. We won't provide direct support really to asylum seekers receiving accommodation support from the Home Office, nor for unaccompanied asylum seeking children. The former receive their support from Serco locally. We do actually have a health outreach service that I'll come on to later that will work with asylum seekers, and unaccompanied children are looked after by the local authority under Section 20 of the Children Act, and there is a separate team that deals with looked after children, which is part of children's services rather. There are some restrictions on services. The hostile environment and government policies do make that quite difficult for migrants to gain access to some services. For the local authority, that primarily sits within Schedule 3 of the Nationality, Immigration and Asylum Act 2002 as amended, and it was amended on the 1st of January. And it prohibits local authorities from providing assistance to an ineligible class of person. And that the Act was amended on the 1st of January to remove the reference to European nationals, but it does now focus on people who are refugees, recognised in another EEA member state, failed asylum seekers who failed to comply with removal directions, people who are unlawfully present in the UK, or a person who is a dependent of one of the above classes of person. So we have to bear that in mind when we're thinking about services through the local authority. I also note that there are other restrictions on other forms of state help, so things like NHS services and benefits. They're restricted by different pieces of legislation, and rather unhelpfully, those pieces of legislation don't always dovetail neatly together. So there may be people who are ineligible for services from the local authority, but eligible for services from the NHS. And the other way around, you may have people who are chargeable for NHS services who are freely eligible for support from local authority. Okay. So having told you about Schedule 3, there are lots of exclusions to that as well. So Schedule 3 doesn't apply to anybody who's a British citizen, even if they are a citizen of another country. They don't apply to a child, don't apply to an asylum seeker who still has an outstanding claim or an appeal, or who has not yet been issued with removal directions, and don't apply to people who currently hold a valid visa permitting them entry to the UK. And they don't apply to European nationals who have been given valid leave under the EU settlement scheme, or for somebody who has applied by the deadline of the 30th of June and is still waiting a decision. So in terms of the European Economic Area, we're talking, it's a phrase that we tend to use rather than EU, because the European Economic Area has a few extra countries in it that weren't EU member states. So that's Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein, and also Switzerland, which is neither a member of the EEA or the EU, but is actually part of the EFTA, the European Free Trade Association. So those are the countries that we are thinking about in terms of EU settlement. The Republic of Ireland doesn't feature on that list, primarily because Irish nationals have free movement across within the British Isles anyway under separate legislation. So there's a kind of borderless issue there. And my team kind of has to be aware, and I think when we're dealing with migrants, we all have to be aware of the various push and pull factors. So why do people economically migrate? And this is primarily looking at migration across the European continent, but could be wider as well. But there's high unemployment maybe in their country where they've come from, particularly amongst younger workers and in rural areas, declining economy, lack of opportunity. And of course, English is frequently taught as a modern foreign language at school, particularly across Europe. So they may all be push factors as to why somebody might choose the UK to come to. Pull factors, the UK has relatively low unemployment still. We have skill shortages, particularly for skilled and semi-skilled workers. We have quite a high GDP compared to most of Europe. Numbers of countries coming from the accession states, the A8 and the A2 countries weren't capped. And we've had our low-cost airlines, our EasyJets and our Ryanairs and others with Air, frequently running routes across Europe, offering cheap travel movement within the European continent, and often higher hourly rates of pay than would be able to be obtained in Eastern Europe. And particularly that last factor enabled people to come over and work and send money back to support their families back in their countries. One of the things that we have to consider as a public body is things around the Human Rights Act. So all decisions of public authorities have to be taken and made in ways that don't infringe the human rights of the individuals we're there to serve. And the requirements of the Human Rights Act must always be considered. And we have to think particularly about whether a decision infringes Article 3, Article 8 and Article 9 in terms of social care, when we're looking at withdrawing or withholding support from somebody by applying Schedule 3 of the 2002 Act. So we have to balance things up, and it's a big balancing act to try and get right. And I don't, it's an assessment. There's no absolute right and wrong answer with any of this. There we go. Article 3 is our absolute right, which is around inhumane, degrading treatment, punishment, and torture. And then Article 8 is around rights to private and family life. And Article 9, rights to freedom of religion, thought, and conscience. So we have to consider those within all of our assessments, and the social workers should all social workers should be practicing according to this. But my team in particular have to have it in the forefront of their mind when we're thinking about doing human rights assessments, which is a phrase you may well hear. So a local authority may provide support in pursuance of powers laid down with Parliament if it's necessary to avoid a breach of the person's human rights. So when we're thinking about the restrictions that are on people's entitlement to support by applying what I talked about earlier in terms of Schedule 3, we have to do a human rights assessment to consider whether the withholding or withdrawal of support would infringe somebody's convention rights. So within a human rights assessment, the social workers will need to determine if the person can return to their country of origin, or if indeed voluntary return would cause a breach of their human rights. Human rights assessment itself is not a gateway assessment. It doesn't result in services being provided. The local authority needs to still carry out an assessment, for example, under the Care Act or even under the Children Act, to decide what services it should provide. And a local authority won't undertake a Human Rights Act assessment for purposes beyond its own duties and powers. So we talk about Human Rights Act assessments quite a lot within the team. They are things that staff in the team will apply to people for whom Schedule 3 applies. And one of the things we have to think about as a local authority is, could the person actually return to their country of origin? And that's an important factor. We have to consider if there are legal and practical barriers to repatriation. We have to consider if they've got outstanding applications that the Home Office are considering, particularly around asylum or Article 3 or Article 8 grounds. And whilst those are under consideration by the Home Office, it wouldn't be right for the person to be supported to go back to their country of origin. And other practical barriers include things like, has the person got identity documents or passports? Are they able to travel, or is their health a factor? Is there some kind of disability or health problem that would prevent them from traveling safely, or indeed, is there a travel ban because of COVID? And we've seen that as one of the factors more recently. There may not be any flights. There may be all sorts of bans on people traveling from the UK, particularly with the Delta variant being quite so high in the UK. We might see that become a bit of a barrier over the summer. If somebody's unfit to travel, we will ask for that to be evidenced in writing by a doctor, and we'll keep that on frequent review. And if the person doesn't have any travel documents, is there some way we could support them to obtain those travel documents? And local authorities are able to give travel assistance to people. If we've decided there's no unlawful breach of human rights, then we could offer to fund somebody's voluntary return if they chose to do so. We can only do that for European nationals who are in the UK lawfully, or if they're refugees of another EEA member state. People from further afield who might be irregularly present in the UK, or failed asylum seekers may be assisted by the Home Office's scheme called the Voluntary Assisted Returns and Repatriation Programme. Locally, my team does quite a lot of liaison with that service, and will provide some on-the-ground assistance for helping people to return if they need to go further afield. And we'd have to also consider within our assessments whether the person could support themselves. Are they able to work? Could we support them to get employment? Do they have permission to work? Could we enable them to obtain benefits, or could they be eligible for local authority housing? That might be through helping them to apply for the EU settlement scheme. For example, there may be people who've got good grounds for not having already made an application and make a late application. And if they are successful in getting settled status, that may well open the door to them accessing benefits and homelessness assistance. One of the other things to consider is if the person is seeking employment, could they seek employment from outside of the UK? If they're living on the streets, one of the options might be to support them to go back to their country of origin, and they can continue to seek work in the UK and return when they've got something more substantial lined up. And we'll also consider whether the person could be a dependent of somebody else and have what's called derivative rights based on the person they're dependent of. And then we'll go on and think about what legal provisions could support be provided to. If we've exhausted the other options that I've spoken about, then has the person got care and support needs falling within the Care Act? And does the person have needs which could not be met without the provision of accommodation? So if somebody needs, say for example, is assessed as needing a package of domiciliary care, and they haven't actually got a place of domicile, arguably they need the accommodation in order to receive the package of support from the local authority, because otherwise providing somebody with home care who hasn't got a home is pretty useless. So the care and support needs would also include provision of accommodation. If that person's got one or more dependent children under 18 living with them, they'll need to go through to children's services, who may need to consider supporting them under Section 17 of the Children Act, promoting the family, the children's welfare, but to live with their parents. There may be ways that that can be done through Section 17. And if the adult has other vulnerabilities or could not leave the UK, local authorities could consider providing assistance under the Localism Act. And that's a bit of a catch-all really to see where either of the above two don't really apply. So hopefully everybody's heard of the EU settlement scheme. There's been lots on the media recently, but that scheme has now effectively, the deadline has passed for applications, although there are grounds upon which somebody could submit a late application. But EEA and Swiss nationals living lawfully in the UK by 31st of December 2020 had until the 30th of June to make an application under the scheme. What's now a bit of a grey area and a bit of a tricky area is people who have European nationals who have remained in the UK but have not yet made an application under the scheme. and they're at risk of being treated as irregularly present in the UK and potentially starting to lose their rights to work, claim benefits, hold bank accounts, rent in the private sector, holding a driving license. So for us, I think this is an area we'll start to see over the coming weeks. We will start to see people who may be on more thin ice and may well need to make an application under the EU settlement scheme as a late application so that they can restore their rights to live in the UK. We've probably had about 5 people referred to the team in the last 7 days who are already falling into this kind of category, and we'll need some support, and we will work with them to try and resolve that if possible, or refer them on to another agency if we can't. So it's quite a complex area around the whole immigration side of things. And then I wanted to talk a little bit more about the Housing to Work scheme, and this is something that we've had a lot of support from, particularly Broadland Housing and Freebridge over in Kings Lynn. So the Housing to Work scheme was something that we made an application to the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government for last summer. They had some short-term funding, and it was really looking at when everybody who were rough sleepers were required to be in. So under the everyone in instruction at the first lockdown, we identified that there were at least 73 homeless or rough sleeping migrants who had no recourse to public funds across the county. Around about 10% of the overall picture. That's not necessarily people sleeping out on the streets. They may be people who are sofa surfing, people who are the invisible homeless that came to the fore, people who may have been living in above business premises that then got closed down or were unable to pay their rent because they may have no recourse to public funds but a right to work. And if somebody was in, so we had, for example, a guy who was a self-employed hairdresser. He'd only been doing it a short period of time, wasn't entitled to the self-employed income support scheme, and he was paying his room rent based on his weekly income. When everything shut down, he had no income and he lost his accommodation. So he's one of those, and he was a no recourse to public funds, but had the right to reside in the UK. So he was one of the ones we helped. So we made a bid to MHCLG, and we were quite successful with that across Norfolk. That enabled us to work with European nationals, who are the majority of the 73, to provide accommodation and subsistence support for up to 12 weeks. So the MHCLG, or the government, varied the rules around local authorities' ability to provide support to people with pre-settled status and people with an extended right to reside under the former regulations. So we were able to provide that for up to 12 weeks. And we also provided support to enable that adult to secure employment, and that included helping them to write CVs, putting them in touch with employment organisations. At the same time, we also helped those who hadn't already applied to apply under EUSS, and to obtain various documents from their consulate to prove their identity. And we also had a small pot of money to help with some move-on support, rent in advance, and a deposit scheme. So once people got to the end of their 12-week period, the idea was that they would have hopefully found some fresh employment, and we could give them some help with some rent in advance and a deposit scheme, and they could then become self-supporting financially. And then beyond that, for those who weren't able to gain employment, we were able to offer voluntary repatriation assistance and support and subsistence for up to 4 weeks for people who were choosing to depart the UK and go back to their country of origin. So we got a lot of support, as I said, from Broadland and also from Freebridge, and Great Yarmouth Borough Council came up with a property as well. And we in total had 5 properties, which we set up as small HMOs. So they were 3 and 4 bedroom properties that we set up as shared accommodation. We furnished and equipped them and provided support workers going into those properties to work with the clients living there and helping to move them on. That scheme is now gradually winding itself down. We've reached the end of the project period, so we've got a few residents still in accommodation, and we're working on their move on plans. And understandably, we had quite a few challenges with that scheme. A number of these European migrants who were with us had underlying issues around alcohol misuse, mental health problems, and other factors that meant they didn't achieve their goals. So I'm still collecting the data, but we probably got about 50% of people had positive move on, and the other 50% didn't manage to achieve that. Some of those went back to their countries of origin, and others, unfortunately, left the scheme due to non-engagement. But we have managed to move some of them on, which is a success. We're never going to be 100% successful, but I think 50% is a reasonable target, given the speed at which we had to set this up and the limited resources, and trying to do it all in lockdown. So I'll answer other questions about housing to work when we get to the end. I wanted to just cover some of the right to rent conditions. So some of you may be aware that from 1st of February 2016, the government introduced requirements for private sector landlords to check in the immigration status of new tenants, and there were various fines that landlords potentially could be fined if they failed to check immigration status. And as a consequence, people who require permission to be in the UK but don't have it, for example, failed asylum seekers, irregular entrants and visa overstayers, would find themselves homeless, and it made their stay in the UK even more difficult. And that was part of the government's hostile environment policies at the time. Not a pleasant piece of legislation at all, but something which quite often put private sector landlords off taking migrants. They would prefer not to. So it's been a bit challenging helping to move people on. The team also deals with families with children who've got no recourse to public funds. We work following an assessment by Children's Services where there are families who have dependent children who've got no recourse to public funds. If they look like they're going to require long-term support with accommodation and subsistence payments, they will transfer to the People from Abroad team, and we will continue to provide that support. And that helps to free up some of the busy Children's Services teams to focus on safeguarding matters rather than maintenance work. We also provide social work support, advice, guidance, and helping to work with families to explore ways to resolve their immigration status, to give them leave to remain, ideally with recourse to public funds. And we put together a child in need plan to ensure the parents can meet their child or children's needs. So how we do that, and this is primarily for people who are unlawfully present in the UK, and not asylum seekers, but they may be visa overstayers, they may be people who have not yet applied under EU settlement scheme, potentially could be those with just pre-settled status who can't get access to benefits. And the way we do that, we take on the properties on a tenancy agreement or a lease, and then we license those properties to families to live in. We pay the rent and we pay their utility bills direct under the Children Act, and then families receive a small subsistence allowance so they can buy their toiletries and essentials and food. And we'll complete a Human Rights Act assessment if that's not already been done, because those NRPF families, the majority of them will require a human rights assessment. Some of the other things that the team deal with, we work quite closely with the police around children, women and men who've been trafficked into, around and out of the UK for a range of reasons. A lot of that can be sexual exploitation, automatic servitude, forced labour, criminal activity, or organ harvesting, although I haven't actually dealt with an organ harvesting case yet in Norfolk. But it does go on across all districts, something we have to be alert to and respond quickly to, work with the safeguarding team up in the MASH, work with the police, and our role really is to provide that welfare support and response to victims. So that's quite a challenging area of work when it comes in. We also work with the specialist police team around cases of honour-based abuse or honour-based violence, although there is no honour in any violence or abuse of any sort. We note that there's no specific offence in UK law at the moment of honour-based crime, but it is covered under various other bits of legislation. And for people who are not really aware of it, HBA is a collection of practices used to control behaviour within families and social groups to protect perceived cultural and religious beliefs or the honour of the family. And violence or abuse can occur when it is perceived by the family or the cultural group that shame has been brought onto the family, breaking the honour code. And the abuses, maybe of human rights, maybe domestic or sexual violence. So they're also quite high level safeguarding things that we deal with. Often occurs within cultural minority cases, Bangladeshi families in particular. We have quite a few of in Norfolk who've got HBA risks, and we will work with the police again to support the victims and put together a safety plan. We also work with leeway on some of these as well, because several of them come into leeway. But honour-based abuse affects men and women, so we will get males who've perceived to have brought shame on their family. We've recently dealt with quite a few cases of HBA in the emergency asylum accommodation that we had last year up at Coltishall. There were several men and women who were there who were needing to be protected from HBA risks. We also work with the police on forced marriage, and again, forced marriage quite often can be a migration related issue. It doesn't have to be, but where one or both of the parties are placed under duress to become married, there are various crimes that the police will investigate and prosecute for, and orders that can be taken out. Again, work that we might well do with leeway, but also with the police, and our social workers in the team will work with the victims to support them and help them be free of that abuse. Returning British nationals, we probably get between 6 and 12 a year. I think this year we'll see an increased number. British nationals who've often retired abroad or gone abroad to work or to live with a partner. If things go wrong, they may well come back to the UK. So British nationals are not subject to the Schedule 3 restrictions I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, nor are they subject to immigration control, but they will often fail the habitual residence test, which will make them ineligible for homelessness assistance, most welfare benefits, and in some cases NHS assistance, or chargeable. They become chargeable for NHS help. Habitual residence test doesn't apply if somebody's deported from the country, but they have to provide proof. And if they're eligible for care and support, which includes service that would be rendered useless without the provision of accommodation, the local authority would still be obliged to provide it. And one of the peculiar twists for returning British nationals, and we quite often see this with British nationals who've retired abroad, and early retirees, they might own a property overseas, and if they come back to the UK to live, that property overseas no longer is their main residence, and they are considered to have a capital asset abroad, which is considered within the financial assessment of the local authority, and they could find themselves liable for the full costs of the provision of care. So they effectively, although they're not in receipt of any benefits, they may become a destitute self-funder, which is a little bit of an oxymoron, really, in a means-tested world. But it's something that we have to kind of grapple with the rules. But returning British nationals, we've got a couple of cases on the go at the moment. We've got one guy who's elderly chap with dementia coming back from Spain. He's currently detained in hospital. He's going to have to come back to the UK, and he'll be admitted to hospital on arrival. And we may well have to detain him at the airport under the Mental Health Act to do that lawfully. And then supporting his wife to come back as well. And he's become quite violent towards her, and it's quite a difficult case. But there are cases like that happen, every month, that come into the local authority. So we're there, and we will do quite a lot of liaison with services abroad to line things up and have some kind of package of support available for the person as they arrive back into the UK, which I think is important, that they don't end up, homeless on the streets and bouncing around emergency homelessness services and making homelessness applications when actually they're ineligible from the word go. It would be better to try and get that right rather than signpost people to the wrong place. So we took on the support for dispersed asylum seekers on the 1st of March, 1st of April last year, in partnership with One Norwich Practices and Pathways. So Maria has particularly been involved in helping to set a lot of this up. So the team provides support to asylum seekers who are placed by the Home Office in Norwich pending the outcome of their asylum claim. And we have a specialist nurse and a support worker who promote access to mainstream health and social care services. Some of you may have been aware of the old City Reach service that we had in Norwich before, which provided support to both asylum seekers and homeless people. And those two said that contract was ended, and we ended up with kind of two work streams, and the asylum seeker one came across to our team. We provide direct input with asylum seekers to help them overcome some of the barriers that they're facing on accessing mainstream services. So the new model is very much looking at not providing a separate service for asylum seekers, but enabling asylum seekers to access the same services that you and I access, and then some acute direct support for people in particular complex cases. We can provide access to food parcels and cleaning packs. We're providing support with accessing COVID testing and promoting vaccinations. We'll help to apply for the HC2 certificates for exemption from the NHS prescription charges. And we do a lot of connecting people up with other services, voluntary groups like New Routes, English Plus, Bridge Plus, and various other groups that can provide ongoing support to those asylum seekers who will be in accommodation provided by Serco. I mentioned that the team was set up as a result of the refugee resettlement programme. So that the team, as I said, was set up in 2016. We received our first group of refugees in February 17. So they're coming up to nearing their 5-year period of refugee status, and we will soon be supporting them or referring them through to NCLS so they can get some support to apply for indefinite leave to remain. This particular programme was originally focused on Syrian nationals, but last year it was widened out and is now called the UK Resettlement Scheme. So they are vulnerable refugees received as referrals from the UN High Commission for Refugees, go to the Home Office screen them and then refer them to the regions, and we match them to properties that we have available. They're given refugee status immediately on arrival, so they automatically have recourse to public funds as soon as they get here. And we have properties in the private rented sector. We furnish them. We use donated furniture. We prepare them ready for families' arrival, so they have a home to move into rather than just bricks and mortar. We devise a support plan to ensure the family could be as independent as possible, and that whole social work approach around trying to build people's independence and self-reliant skills and not be reliant on the state is the ethos that we come from. So we work to find children places in schools. We help families to register with GPs, open the bank accounts, apply for welfare benefits. In partnership with the Adult Learning Department at Norfolk County Council, we provide ESOL classes for adults, and we also have a preschool creche facility for children so that both mums and dads can do learning of English at the same time. We use volunteers to provide befriender support out in the community. We'll connect people to local community and voluntary groups, move them on to employment support when they're ready, and every family we have is allocated a support worker for the duration of their support, which can be up to 5 years. So refugee resettlement program is quite a big part of our work. That's probably about 50% of our work. And we go on and have some funding from the EU until December 2020 to support non-European migrants who've got permission to work in the UK and who've achieved entry level 2 or above to gain employment. So we'll provide vocational support, learning language skills that are relevant to their area of work or intended area of work. We have a skills assessment using a EU continental recognised assessment. We will work with them to overcome some of the barriers to employment, and we'll look at work experience and volunteering opportunities for those individuals. And once they've got a job, they get 3 months support during the initial period to make sure that that's going to work for them and they can stick at the job. And this scheme came as a result of some research which says on average a refugee will take 6 years from a grant of status to gaining employment. And during that time, they remain on welfare benefits. So the aim of the programme is to significantly reduce that timeline and promote access to the employment market. And we reckon we can get that down from 6 years to 2 with this programme, which is an ambitious target, but it will have a significant impact on the public purse in terms of the welfare benefits bill. But also it's good for people's well-being. It's great to promote their independence, their sense of contributing back to society and earning money for themselves, and hopefully earning more money than they would have got on benefits so that they've got more money to support their family. So I've come to the question section and I've realised I haven't really talked about the Afghan refugee programme. Really, the Afghan interpreters scheme is something that came around from the government over the summer, looking at supporting Afghan nationals who were supporting the British and the US military in their operations in Afghanistan. And since the military operations have ceased, those individuals who are supporting the military bases are now at risk. They and their families are now at risk. They're perceived to be traitors to the state. And the UK government has committed to receive 3,000 Afghan nationals and their families by the end of August. So we've been working flat out looking to resource accommodation and equip it and get it ready to receive some families in. So Norfolk has committed to helping the government to achieve its quota. Not all 3,000 will be coming to Norfolk, you'll be all pleased to know. But we've got a small quota. We're looking to take about 8 households in total. We've got 4 properties that we've offered to the Home Office, and we've got another 4 in the pipeline. But equally, if there were 1 or 2 more properties available, we would be happy to consider those. Ideally, we're looking at keeping those in the Greater Norwich area, simply because, rather like the refugee resettlement programme, the mosques and the community groups and the halal food shops are all in the Norwich area. There's very few of those elsewhere. And transport links are better in Norwich. We've got the bus service, and we've got a more diverse community in Norwich. We've got voluntary groups that people can join, and the English classes we deliver are in Norwich. So I appreciate that's very Norwich-centric model, but the further we go out into the rural parts of the county, the more difficult it is to deliver a service. That's not to say we wouldn't consider properties elsewhere, but at the moment, that's how we are delivering. So I've done my whistle stop tour in, I said 45 minutes, and we're just under that. So
thank you very much, Simon.
I'll hand back to Katie.
Yeah, thank you. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat. Chris, did you want to come on and ask Simon your question?
Yes, if I could. Thanks, Simon. That was really interesting. And I'm sorry I couldn't be right at the start of your presentation, and apologies if you've already covered this. But I just wondered, obviously we're reaching I've been talking to our rough sleeper advisor from the Ministry of Housing, and obviously we're lucky that numbers are relatively small at the moment in Norwich, but there are people who are sick or are not work ready and may have pre-settled status. There's issues around them accessing help, and some of those people may well have care and support needs, but don't necessarily meet the care and support needs of county council. So I just wondered, how do you see that panning out for those particular individuals going forward?
Okay, so in terms of, you've put in the chat about people with pre-settled status, and there's currently, I'm sure Julia will be able to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but there's an appeal court judgment which found the government's policy on pre-settled status and habitual residence test application for universal credit to be unlawful, overturned it, but the government have appealed that to the Supreme Court, and we're waiting on the judgment on that. And last time I looked, the Supreme Court judgment was paused pending the outcome of a European Court judgment around the same area, I believe. So we are in a bit of a grey area in terms of people with pre-settled status and the habitual residence test, particularly being able to apply for universal credit. Under the old European rules, people who are sick and not able to work may have something called retained worker rights. And I'm not too clear on how that pans out within the Appendix EU of the immigration rules. I would, in these sorts of cases, I'd probably be going to NCLS and asking them to look with a more detailed view at welfare benefits. So I certainly under the old European Union or European national rules, regulations, people could be permanently sick and get a permanent right to reside if they'd been working in the UK for 2 years rather than the full 5.
Yeah.
And people could get permanent right to reside if they reached state retirement age before they'd acquired their 5 years. I believe that's called early settled status under the Appendix EU of the rules. But that's not an area that I would have an answer straight off for. I'd have to go and research it.
And from what I understand, is it right that when people have failed status, that they'll be given a 28-day notice to leave the country? Is that correct?
So if somebody hasn't applied for EU SS and they are encountered by immigration enforcement, they'll get a letter giving them 28 days within which to apply.
Right. Okay.
For immigration, as local authorities, both district councils and county councils, as far as I understand, we are not required to issue those letters. That's an enforcement function of immigration, not local authorities.
Yeah. Okay.
If somebody, so that's only if they haven't made an application. If somebody's made an application under the EU settlement scheme and it's been refused on the grounds of suitability, criminality grounds. If they've got a massive criminal history, then the EU settlement scheme will refer that person directly to immigration enforcement. And there is a mechanism for dealing with those individuals at that point.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Simon.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you. Catherine, you had a question. Did you want to come on and ask?
Thanks, Katie. Simon, thank you. I always feel like I just learn loads from you whenever we talk, and every time I'm like, oh, I thought I knew about this, but I don't. I think you said there were was it 73 migrants?
73. Yeah.
Well, I just wondered two things. One is kind of what's the level now? What sort of issue are we looking at in terms of homelessness now that funding's stopped? And secondly, you've got some people in the virtual room here. If you could ask us for one thing to support to support migrant homelessness, to tackle migrant homelessness, what would that one thing be?
That's a big ask, isn't it? So I'll go back to your first question. So I don't have the figures of where we're at now. It was quite a difficult task to get the figures. When we had everyone in, we had kind of a bit of a captive audience, really. We knew who we had, and district councils knew where they'd placed them, and they could flag up which ones were no recourse. Probably about half of them have been resolved, either because they've returned to work or they've gone back to their countries of origin. We've done quite a few voluntary repatriations in the last few months. Particularly, I noticed an increase from March. We're getting a higher number of people who are coming to us saying, well, I want to go back home. Quite a lot of Romanians going back. That seems to be the biggest group. And they may well just found that the life in the UK is too tough and they've not been able to make a go of it, and they've decided to go back. Yeah, Chris is saying the districts should have a fair idea in their numbers. I think that of those 73, not all of them were out on the streets. Some of them were the sofa surfers. They may have gone back to sofa surfing again. I looked at the Norwich minutes from the Pathways meeting. I looked at them last night. There were 2 people on that list who appear to be out on the streets at the moment who are no recourse to public funds in Norwich. So but they are the verified rough sleepers out in the shop doorways and tents and things like that. So we've got some into employment. We've moved a small number of people into renting a room in the private sector. Great Yarmouth was reasonably successful. We got quite a few people into getting rented stuff in the private sector. We also had quite a lot of disengagements in Great Yarmouth as well. So I don't have an exact number for you, Catherine, but that's where we're kind of at now. We're probably dealing with 20 or so homeless individuals at the moment and looking at various options and exploring whether they've got friends, family they can stay with. Those are the rough sort of numbers. And then the one thing to ask people in this meeting, well, the easy thing to ask is not to label every migrant as having no recourse to public funds. First thing, check, get a copy of their ID or their passport. And just because somebody is a non-British national, don't assume that they haven't got status in the UK. Check. It's very easy to label somebody NRPF when in actual fact they aren't. And if we start pushing people away from services, they potentially become exploited. And that's one of the bigger risks that we see, that if people find that they haven't got anywhere to live, they could end up in modern slavery. They could be exploited. They could be working, in a car wash for £3 an hour or something. Or I think get the information, get a copy, and ask. I wouldn't want somebody turned away just because they weren't able to prove. In my team, we do quite a lot of immigration status checks, so we can go to the Home Office and we can ask the Home Office to tell us. Equally, district councils should have a kind of urgent phone line to be able to call to check on somebody. And very recently, the Home Office set up a rough sleepers helpline for local authorities to be able to ring in for their caseworkers to register, and they can just phone in on a special number and get an immigration status check on somebody that they've come across. So I'm not sure whether Pathways have joined that. Maria, do you know? Put Maria on the spot at this point.
No, not that I'm aware of, but if you can pass me the details.
Let me find it for you. Let me find it for you. You might have to be on a gov.uk email address.
That's what I was then, but that was my next question.
Yeah, he might have to be on that. So that might be something that
maybe
Chris
Hayley could help us with that
Hayley,
now.
Hayley or Dion might have to do it.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay,
so that's that one. Daryl's put a note in the chat. Is there many issues between transition from children's services at age 18 to adult services, especially around housing? Daryl, do you want to expand upon that a little bit more?
I think it was just going on from the point that we pick up quite a few young people through the YMCA through that transition period, because children's services move them on at 18. But I think it's also going on to the point that Maria made under us. They sometimes have limited access with their benefits, and that leads to additional challenges for them, I suppose. And I think as the people from abroad team, I don't know if those young adults still have some relationship, say, with your team.
So if they've been in care, they will have an ongoing relationship with the leaving care team until they're at least 21, and ideally till they're 25 if they're in education.
Yeah, I think we'd say that's a hope-filled aspiration.
Yeah.
As a provider.
Yeah. But they should have a pathway plan. So one of the things would be maybe to ask to see a copy of the pathway plan.
Yeah.
If we've got a young person who's been supported by children's services under section 17, though, they've not been accommodated, so they will finish at 18. So I have taken on some cases as transition over. So I've got a young man at the moment who turns 18 next month, and we've already taken him into the team, and we'll continue to support him while we're sorting out his EU settlement application, and he's estranged from his family, living with his girlfriend. So we've taken him on, and I guess the transition between adults and children can be a bit tricky at times. As a team who straddles both departments, we're always open to those discussions with the children's services practitioners. But yeah, it's not always that fluid. Does that kind of answer your
Thank you.
question? Yeah, I'm not going to be able to turn that around to something amazing.
So Carla just asked whether you could put together details of the outcomes from the scheme, if it could be
of
done.
the everyone in scheme, or
I'm assuming that's what you mean, Carl. Is that correct?
From your housing to work scheme? Yeah, I mean, we've done something similar for everyone that we've housed through everyone in, and it's been really helpful to us to understand where people are now, really, and whether was it just a sticking plaster, or have we actually achieved something and real sustainable outcomes for people.
Well, we had two properties in Kings Lynn, 2 in Norwich and 1 in Great Yarmouth for that scheme, so they will be by the geographic area in which the property is located rather than by district council area. But I've asked the team to provide some data. I think we did it for the Great Yarmouth area already, but I'll have to look back on that.
That would really helpful if you could do that. It's something that we are concerned about, this area, as to we're lucky at the moment we don't have any rough sleepers, but in that we're conscious that this is kind of a risk area going forward.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's never going to be solved 100%, but everyone in was an opportunity where we had a bit of a captive audience to be able to try and move people through and try and find some exit solutions from homelessness for some of those individuals. Yeah, Chris has put there's some guidance coming out regarding NRPF and rough sleepers. I would always point people to the NRPF network if you haven't come across that, nrpfnetwork.org.uk, and there is guidance for local authorities on there. So for district council colleagues who are on the call, there are some practical guidance on there, and there's some updated information about European nationals that's gone on there.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Did anyone else have any questions? Wanted to come on and say anything or raise your hand? Lovely. Okay. So I think that will be it. Is that right, Paula? Looking to you now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unless there's any more questions.
Unless there's any more.
Paula's got a copy of that presentation. I think, Paula, you're going to email that around to people?
Yeah, I will email that round, and I'll pop the copy of the video up onto the website and send you a link to both of those.
Fab.
Yeah. All right.